Hello, thank you for joining me. This is What I've Been Thinking with Marcus Cage. I'm your host, Marcus Cage. In this episode today, what I want to talk about is Martin Luther King. Of course, it's his birthday, and everybody is doing, their appreciations to Martin Luther King and going over his famous speeches and talking about the legacy of King. And of course, he was very influential to me, and I tried to take on a lot of the principles and ways he went about things and a lot of the issues that he wanted and tried to fight for. And I consider myself trying to pick up and continue on that legacy, at least how I stand on certain political issues and stances and issues within society in general. Most people focus mainly on the "I have a dream" speech. And that is a wonderful and beautiful speech. But the one speech which I would like to focus on would be his last speech. His last speech was the "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. I'm pretty sure most of you guys are familiar with both of the speeches, but the "I have a dream" speech, I feel, is a lot more famous, and I feel that as a society, we have worked to get closer to some of the objectives in that speech which he articulated. So I wanted to talk about the "I've been to the mountaintop" speech because some of the things which he said in there, I believe, are some of the most poignant issues and topics which he really cared about, especially towards the end before he was assassinated, and some of the issues which, even if you pay attention to earlier speeches and earlier interviews and conversations which he had with various people, he was always focused on economic issues. Though the focus got put more on the civil rights and equality and nonviolent protest and the Selma bus boycotts and all those things like that. I could be wrong, and this is just my, I guess, tinfoil theory on it. I believe that the economic issues, which he began to start speaking out more vociferously on, are the issues which led to his assassination. Yeah, some of the things that he was trying to work on were poverty. Poverty was one of the biggest issues. He was trying to get rid of poverty because he noticed that even dealing with racial issues are tied in with class issues most of the time, because most of the people who are at the bottom of the lower class mostly are people of color and women most of the time. Housing. He was very concerned about the homeless population. And he was worried about that the effects on people and their families is dealing with homelessness and how that affects the mental psyche, how that leads to crime, depression, all of those different things, despair, and being away from God. He was a very religious man, so of course that was one of the things that he definitely focused on for those of you who are not religious or not Christians. Full employment. And he said, and create incomes, in which I interpret that is living income, an income where you are able to go in there, work a full-time job, and that job is enough to provide for you and your family. Those were some of the major things which were part of the Poor People's Campaign. Another thing which he talked about as far as the poverty issue and addressing and helping address that was UBI, which Andrew Yang talks about. Although I believe that the way he would have done it would have been very different, the idea is still similar, and it's the same idea, and it's coming from that tree of Dr. King. Another thing which a lot of people don't focus on as much is Vietnam was going on at the time towards the end of Dr. King's death. And Vietnam was an issue which he did speak about. For those of you who don't know, who probably should know, a pastor, more than likely, most of them are going to be nonviolent, but he was very much against a lot of these foreign wars and intervening in other countries. And sorry for getting a little tied up there, but the anti-war message was something that Dr. King was very strong on and that he definitely believed in. Another issue which doesn't get much attention from Dr. King, and I will give you a quote as far as how he viewed things on healthcare. He said, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in the healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane because it often results in physical death." I'll repeat that one more time. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and humane because it often results in physical death. That right there is a push for universal healthcare. One of the things which I wanted to talk about is in that march which he had for the sanitation workers when he did the "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. He was there focusing on trying to work on union rights, work on wages, work on a number of different things. Now, it's focused on through a lens of just the sanitation workers from some people's perspective, but it's much broader than that. He was talking about the average person in general, that they should be able to have the means, the benefits to be able to take care of themselves, whether we're talking about economic, whether we are talking about healthcare, whether we're talking about retirement, whether we're talking about trying to get a fair loan to be able to start a business or buy a home. All of these things were issues that were very, very important to Dr. King, which are often not highlighted on. I mean, just recently, I was watching, some of the cable news pundits and how they talked about how Dr. King was such an influence and an impact on them. And then I watched them out of the very same breath pump up and push people who would have been on the opposing side of King on a lot of these issues. So that's one of the things that I really wanted to talk about. When we say that we admire King, do we just admire King for his speeches and the way he was able to communicate? Or do we admire King for the principles that he stood on and what he was pushing for and willing to die for? That's a deeper question which you have to ask yourself, and it's perfectly fine if you're not a true believer in the issues and stances and the approaches which Dr. King wanted to take. That's perfectly fine, but you, as I say all the time, let's be honest with where we stand on things. If you're just fine with the speeches, but you really don't want to push for the things which King said, then when it's King's birthday, please don't be a phony and get out there and pretend that you are a big supporter and follower of King and that he influenced your decisions and influenced your path on the way you see things. You can't have that perspective and then argue against the policy positions which he would have went for. A couple of things which I wanted to talk about that people don't know about King is that King was a registered Republican for pretty much his whole life. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that he was still a registered Republican even at the time of his death. That does not mean that he would have been lockstep or agreed with the Republican Party up to date. Because what is often not characterized properly, or one side of the aisle wants to frame it however they want to frame it. What actually happened is when the Civil Rights Act was pushed for and passed for, a lot of the major power players from both of the parties felt a certain way about the Civil Rights Act. There were plenty of Democrats who were furious, who did not want any part of it, which they were formerly known as the Dixiecrats. A lot of those Democrats, Southern Democrats, a lot of them went over to the Republican Party. Many Republicans who were a lot more liberal on social issues, especially who had a lot of pause and heartache towards what they were seeing being done to the African American community, to the Jewish community, and in certain areas at the time, the Latino community, especially with a lot of the early Mexican American population in places like Texas and California and a lot of the Southwest. Though a lot of those things were not focused on as much, I think that we should keep an eye on all of these things. A lot of people know about, the Selma the Selma boycotts, the busing boycotts, Rosa Parks, and all those different things. We all know about, the I Have a Dream speech with a big march on the mall to Washington, D.C. But here's something I found interesting that I don't feel a lot of people do know, that because of the racial tenor in the country at the time, because of the acceptance or the, I guess, lack of pushback against it from a lot of the top American corporations, Dr. King actually advocated for boycotting a lot of those major corporations which shared any kind of racist ideology or were sympathetic to racist ideologies. Many of those corporations, which were the top corporations at the time, no longer exist, but there are a few which I saw, which I wanted to bring up. One of them was Wonder Bread. Another one was Coca-Cola, specifically the Coca-Cola plant of Memphis. A lot of people don't know, or who consider themselves big time capitalists now, have no problem with corporations not adhering to ethical or moral standards until they're pushed to. And then once the public gets, outraged and their arms and they get up in arms, that's when the politicians come, and jump on the bandwagon at the last minute. And what I ask for you guys to do who are out there listening, I ask for you to just, it's enough of giving people the benefit of the doubt. Most of these politicians have been in power for many years. They have watched some things improve. They have helped some things get worse. And we all know that. And I ask any one of you out there, if you were not doing well at your job, if you were making repeated mistakes, or if you were given a contract or a project to do that took a long period of time. And at the end of that time, you delivered a substandard product, or you were incomplete, or it had all kind of problems and headaches with it, you would normally be fired or be held on some kind of lawsuit behind it. And if we hold each other to that standard, the different contracts that which we'll have with, say, it's a maintenance company or a construction company or whichever company that it might be, we will do contracts and expect for them to hold to a certain standard. And most of these corporations and companies, I'm talking about mainly private, of course, have a certain standard within their own corporation that they try to adhere to, as far as just for their own business model to continue to be a profitable company and to bring in future business. Now, that said, if we're going to hold each other to these kind of standards, and we're not going to hold business or large business or our local politicians or even our national politicians to these same standards. I mean, keep in mind, most of these people, they're not like you and I. You know, some of us might have graduated only high school. Some didn't graduate high school, only have a GED. Some have a little bit of college, but maybe didn't complete with their degree. You know, I can go on and on and on. You guys know where you guys are, and you guys know how most average people kind of stack out as far as these things. But if you look at Congress, if you look at the Senate, you look at their backgrounds, it's pretty much like a 90% at least bachelor's degree. So we're dealing with people who have spent time within formalized education. They've studied history. They studied a certain amount of economics. They studied a certain amount of all these things that are going on. And they have risen to be the best, quote unquote, in their different fields or expertise or whatever, however you want to say it. But yet, with all this knowledge and them being the cream of the crop, we're having trouble understanding where we're having trouble understanding, you know, not having trouble understanding, but we're just giving these people the benefit of the doubt, which we would never give to anyone else. And these people are supposed to be more enlightened, more educated, more intelligent, supposed to get it more. If these people are smarter and more intelligent and all these things, then why give them the benefit of the doubt? How I look at it is, I assume that everything they're doing, they understand what they're doing. They understand the actions and the implications of all those things. And they're just trying to see how much of it they can get away with and you buy it. I think that's a more fitting way to look at it. So, you know, I know I got a little bit off on a tangent and got going a bunch of different places. But what I wanted to mainly say is that a lot of these people who want to speak the King legacy and say, well, you know, King was this and King was that, and only speak great things about him, you got to understand that it's about his policies and what he stood for. That's where the love for King was. It was about what he was trying to accomplish, not just about flowery words like I heard, you know, our former president say. You know, President Obama, how he spoke about Martin Luther King was just he was a great orator, and he was great at writing speeches. And I'm like, my issue with that is we're focusing on the wrong things. It's not about how great of a speaker he was, and Martin was a great, great speaker. It's about what his speeches did. His speeches galvanized people. It alerted people to what's going on, and it forced us to have to pay attention to issues and problems to either decide, I'm going to ignore this problem, I'm going to disagree with you and say there's not a problem, or I'm going to do something. And now in this day and age, we don't have a person who has that level of backing and confidence behind a mass group of people to be able to share that message. I mean, after he passed away, in my opinion, a lot of those who weren't killed during the movement, or who weren't thrown in prison, or completely, obliterated through media coverage, the rest of those people who were in the movement mostly, cashed in for themselves. Most of them went off to Congress and they sat back and they put in symbolic measures for the things that they championed before they were in office. And then there's the other big chunk of them who did nothing at all and just kept a poster of Martin on the wall, while allowing the next generation, my generation, and the Gen Xers before, because technically I'm considered a millennial, but I'm right on the cusp, so bear with me. My generation was left without that kind of leadership. We were left with mostly the criminals on the street, drug dealers, people who had money in their pocket, and most of them who got money through nefarious schemes, or stealing, or some kind of violence. And the great intellectuals through the 60s and the 70s, as a kid of the 80s, we weren't left with those people. And now that I've had the time, especially at my age now, to do enough studying and learning and researching on my own, I call for those of you who, while I was a child, or even before I was born, who were strong in the camp of the civil rights era, with the Martin Luther Kings, with James Baldwins, with Harry Belafontes, with, the Bob Marleys, with all the different people of that era who pushed and who were willing to die to improve things in this country for everyone, not just Black people or not just other people of color. They were looking to try to build a better world. And I challenge every one of you out there to not only be a fan and admire people like Martin Luther King. I ask for you to try to at least take 1 or 2 steps in the direction of the action.